There we go. So it is great to see everybody, and thank you for being here for our second of 6 meetings as we talk together about the Gospel of Mark. For those who weren't with us last time, today we're going to focus on the first 4 chapters. Actually, let me back up. We're going to finish up some background work that we started to do last week, and then we're going to talk about the first 4 chapters, which I asked everyone to read. If you happen not to read those again, I know we have a couple here that are with us today who weren't with us last time. You're certainly welcome to don't worry. You won't. We're going to walk through things together. In fact, I asked those who were here to read and make notes, maybe ask questions of the text. So we'll take some time to talk about what everyone saw. But this would be a good time to say, whether you were here last time or not, if you've got a Bible handy, you can collect it because we'll be looking at some things together in the text. So just an FYI there. But let me go ahead then and open us again with a word of prayer quickly, and then I'll share my screen as I did last time and put some PowerPoint slides up, and we'll kind of progress as we did previously with some PowerPoints together. So. And hi to those. I'm just about to say a word of prayer. Looks like we've got Ellen again. And is it Daniel? Nice to have you with us. Yeah, great to see everybody here today. So let me say a quick word of prayer and we'll begin. Gracious God, we continue to thank you for this opportunity to gather and study the Gospel of Mark. Lord, let our time again be edifying, and Lord, open our hearts and our minds to hear your word anew, afresh. Oftentimes we return to the scriptures and we've studied them before, and we are grateful for all that we've learned, but sometimes that can cloud our vision and prevent us from seeing new things. Help us, Lord, to come to the text with a fresh set of eyes today and walk away from our time together not only with a greater knowledge, but also a renewed faith. And so strengthen our faith, Lord, and may this time that we have ultimately be to your glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, looks like Pat also is connecting. It's nice to see so many folks here today. So I am, as I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen and pull up some PowerPoint slides. I'm going to start us right where we left off last time. Here, slideshow, if I can. Current slide. Okay. All right. So at the end of our time last week, we had spent most of the time that we were together talking about some background to the Gospel of Mark, and including some of the historical context, the traditional ascription of the gospel to a disciple of Peter named Mark, and that John Mark that is likely, or well may have been at least, the John Mark that is mentioned in the book of Acts. We talked about all of that, and then we got right up to the point where we were also going to say a few words about the contributions of modern, quote unquote, critical Bible scholarship. And as I had mentioned, that really starting in the 1700s, especially European scholars, and above all German, frankly, began to read the biblical texts with an analytical eye regarding their composition, especially. So not just assuming, if you will, that the texts came through one source. Peter would have passed a version on to Mark, and Mark just sort of scribed it down, but rather that Mark and the other synoptics in particular, and that's what we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We call them synopses of Jesus' life and ministry. They present kind of a historical overview, if you will, whereas John has a much more theological orientation. So we kind of divide the Gospels between 2 kinds: the synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John is his own sort of kind of writing. But especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we call the synoptic Gospels, show evidence, modern scholarship realized, show evidence of having been edited together. And so that maybe what we have are multiple sources. So Mark, to come to the point, could then very well have been learning from Peter, but then also drawing on oral tradition about Jesus that was being shared among early followers of Christ in the late 30s into the 40s into the 50s, and then Mark, again, we talked about last time, probably wrote sometime in the mid 60s to the church in Rome. And so by the mid 60s, surely there is some oral tradition and maybe even some early written traditions, some just collection of sayings. They wouldn't have been put together in a systematic way like the writers of the Bible are going to start to do, but they're just sayings of Jesus that were maybe written down. So I want to talk a little bit about why modern scholarship drew such conclusions, and why being aware of them, it can help us actually as we read a gospel like Mark. And then when we're done with this last bit of background, we'll go ahead and then transition to the gospel itself, and we'll start looking at Mark 1 through 4. And at that time, I certainly want to talk about what you read for those who were able to read a bit between last week and this week. So let's just talk a little bit about, again, what these modern Bible scholars have observed. And we're going to work pretty basically here. We're not going to get into great detail. I'm not certainly going to go into the Greek text here much at all, but there are some things that just by a pretty careful, if you will, reading of the English text, raises some interesting questions. So one of the things that readers of Mark's gospel have observed is that there are some repetitions. And so if you have your Bible and you want to skip ahead to Mark 14, we can look at these passages together here. And in Mark 14, of course, we're getting to the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. It'll lead, of course, to his crucifixion. When Judas is introduced here by Mark in chapter 14, verse 10, we can see how he's introduced. If you look at your Bible, it says, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray Jesus to them." Now that's so Mark's introducing Judas, he's introducing him as one of the 12, right? Explaining that. But skip ahead then to verse 20, and we read again. Jesus said to them, talking about the one who's to betray them, "It is one of the 12 who is dipping bread into the bowl with me." Well, that's not much of a repetition. It's another reference, maybe deliberate there on Mark's part. But skip ahead again to verse 43. Immediately, while he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him, there was a crowd with swords and clubs and so on. So why does Judas keep getting described as one of the 12? That's an interesting question. And it would be unnecessary, I guess, at least that first and that second. Is Mark just forgetting that he's already introduced Judas as one of the 12? Or here's another possibility. Mark is drawing off of source material. And the source material that Mark is using describes Judas as one of the 12. And for whatever reason, Mark doesn't feel a great freedom to edit it too much. So what Mark is doing is simply bringing it together. So bringing stories of Jesus and sayings of Jesus together with slight or very light, we might say, editorial revision along the way. But for the most part, just letting those stories and sayings stand as Mark has received them, because he doesn't want to tinker with them much. And so he sacrifices a little bit of, you might say, literary quality, I guess, by allowing such repetitions to stand. That's, again, one conclusion that modern Bible scholars have drawn from these repetitions. Others are bigger than that. Well, that's not much of one. True. But in Mark, we have multiple feeding stories, for instance. So you're familiar with the feeding of the 5,000, but as we'll see when we get to chapter 8 of Mark, there's a second feeding, now of 4,000. Well, did Jesus do 2 feeding miracles? Possibly. Or has Mark encountered two miracle stories of Jesus feeding a multitude and slightly edited them to make bigger points? Pretty clearly, the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6 is an attempt to connect Jesus to the feeding of Israel that happened in the wilderness with Moses. And then in chapter 8, there's some editorial comment that's made after Jesus feeds the 4,000, which suggests that Jesus might, that there's another application for it beyond even the feeding of Israel in the wilderness. So we're starting to get a little bit into the weeds. I want to pause here and take some questions in a minute. But it's these it's sort of reading Mark with this sort of, again, quote unquote, critical eye, or we might say analytical. Critical not in the sense of criticizing the text, but reading it with an eye to try to discern why there are these unnecessary repetitions in there with regards to just, if it was just a story from start to finish, and there was an author who was kind of really crafting it, we may not expect these, but we have them, and why are they there? We've already seen in this second category that Mark's geography is quite interesting, and if you paid close attention in chapter 1, you see that Jesus is all over the place in chapter 1. He goes from Nazareth to the Jordan River, to the wilderness, to the Sea of Galilee, to Capernaum, to a synagogue, to Simon's house, to the desert, to towns of Galilee, and then to another town of Galilee, Capernaum. Why? Mark wouldn't need to specify that Jesus goes from the towns of Galilee to Capernaum, because Capernaum is one of the towns in the region of Galilee. So why is that done? Could it be that, again, Mark is drawing off of a source that has Jesus doing certain things here at the start of chapter 1 in Capernaum? And so even though just before the source, a different source maybe had Jesus in the towns of Galilee, Mark is continuing to include this geography. Maybe. I will suggest here there is more to it. I think one of the challenges of modern biblical scholarship is it sometimes makes the editorial work of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular, it makes it almost at times seem sloppy. It can tend that direction. I'm characterizing it here. Again, we're not going to go into great detail, but there are plenty of Bible scholars who pull back and say, wait a minute, these are not sloppy works. They're actually very intricately crafted. And so even if what Mark might be doing is drawing off of multiple sources, and that's reflected in the fact that the geography is sort of erratic, there's probably another reason why Mark has kept it in there. And I'm going to come back to that. We're going to see it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how geography functions in the Gospel of Mark. It's not, in other words, just an accident that we see these different place names come up because Mark happened to be using different sources and didn't edit them out. Some Bible scholarship suggests that, and I think that's unfair to Mark, and many other scholars do as well. They think that makes Mark just seem like this unthinking editor who's just drawing sources together and not realizing, oh, I've already said that, and oh, Jesus was here, and now he's here, and now he's there, and oh, I forgot, or something like that. These are much more thoughtful presentations than that. Finally, the last thing is, I'm going to talk a bit about this in just a second. I'm going to pause here. Matthew and Luke. So these other two Gospels, going back to Augustine. So this is going back to the 4th century, early 5th century. The reception of these writings was such that Matthew is thought to have written first. So it's no accident that Matthew comes first in our New Testament canon when the books are all compiled. And that didn't happen again until at least the 4th century, that we can see a clear compilation of the books. We're probably somewhere around the 4th century. They're being compiled in the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd. They're being written, and then they're starting to be passed around. But it's not that we can tell for sure until the 300s that we have a clear collection in a book of all the 27 books of the New Testament. But by that time, Augustine then has received a tradition and is teaching that Matthew wrote first. And so in all the subsequent compilations that we have, including our modern English Bibles, Matthew comes first in the order of books. Another contribution to modern biblical scholarship, however, has been a strong conclusion, and I agree with this conclusion, I think, and most do, it's the consensus view that Mark actually wrote first. That's relevant because it does show that that there are sources out there that these authors are drawing from. Mark is going to now function, in other words, as a source for Matthew and Luke. And if Mark functions as a source for them, might Mark also have been looking at other sources, or at the very least, again, received other oral sources that he's sequencing together. So I'll come to that in just a sec, because I have another slide just on that idea that Matthew and Luke have used Mark. But I want to pause just for now and take any questions. I'll even stop the share here for a second, and we'll come back together as a group. And just, I know that's kind of a lot. I don't mean to sort of overwhelm us with modern Bible scholarship, but any thoughts as you're hearing some of this and encountering? Have you noticed these things? Have you ever read any of the Gospels and had questions like, oh yeah, that's interesting, that seems like a repetition, or I don't know why this would come after that, or something like that? Have you ever asked those kinds of questions of the text as you've read it? Or does this just sound like like the boring work of overactive Bible scholars?
Isn't the Bible, there's a lot of repetition in the Bible?
There is. Yeah.
There's a lot of it. They just say it once and they say it again.
Yeah. So why does that happen, Ed? That's the question, right?
I don't know.
Well,
make sure you get it.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, repetition does have a didactic function, as we say. It does too. When I taught, I would repeat myself all the time, even if it seemed boring, because I want students to remember, right?
Right.
How pure would you expect the Gospel of Mark ended up in the Bible to be what he wrote originally? I mean, because they did add, this is the Gospel according to Mark.
Mm-hmm. Right, like titles.
But did you think this 8-chapter structure that he started and ended with was how he wrote it originally?
That's an outstanding question, John. Really great question. So there's quite a bit of discussion about how much editing each of the Gospels underwent. You make some, and some of these start from pretty broad observations, like the one John just made, and that is, titles get added later, chapter divisions and verse divisions get added later. Even more substantively than that, around the 2nd century, as I recall, I've got to go back and look, there are introductions that were composed to the Gospels. And they are composed in addition to that, they're clearly composed as kind of summary statements of the Gospels, but they would have been then appended to them. And they were composed in order, in particular, to counteract, if you like, the influence of what had become known as false teaching. So there's an introduction, and it's important that the introduction to the Gospel of Mark that got composed, because it tells us a bit about who Mark was again as a disciple of Peter. And the point is to say that, hey, this gospel says these things over against these things that you might have heard. That's the whole point. So we know that there was some freedom, long story short, to do this kind of thing going way back into the earliest days of the church, to append like introductions to the Gospels. That said, I think it's a fair judgment to say that the gospel forms that we have are substantially, overwhelmingly the same as the forms that were read by the earliest church. So in other words, there is clear evidence, John, yes, unequivocally, that minor editorial work was done over the centuries to maybe correct scribal errors at times, so copying mistakes that happened. There is some work that's been done probably to, well, here, let me see if I can illustrate this. Okay, yeah, go back to Mark chapter 1, if you've got your Bible. And if someone would just read the very first part of Mark 1, verse 2. Actually, does someone have I know it'd be this because I can reference, does someone have an NRSV Bible, that translation?
Yeah.
Alden, you do? Okay, Alden. Okay, Alden, would you read the very first line of Mark chapter 1, verse 2.
As it is written in the prophet Isaiah.
Okay, excellent. Now, after Isaiah, do you have a little letter D or a footnote?
Yes.
Okay, would you read that footnote for us?
Other ancient authorities read in the prophets.
Okay, all right. So everybody out here, see, does anyone else have a Bible that has a footnote there that says in their footnotes what Alden's does? Other ancient authorities read in the prophets. So we have,
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
John, is that what yours has?
Yes.
Okay. So we have, as it was written in the prophet Isaiah, but then a footnote's put in there. It says, but not every manuscript says that. Now, why do you think that not every manuscript that has come to us has in the prophet Isaiah, but some just have in the prophets? Well, if you keep reading, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Where does that come from? The first half does not come from Isaiah. It comes from the prophet Malachi. The second half, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, that's Isaiah. Okay, that's Isaiah 40. So what happened? All right, well, backing up, in terms of sort of ancient Jewish practice, Isaiah was considered kind of the premier later prophet. You have the earlier prophets, Moses, Elijah, and then you have later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, so on and so forth, okay, Ezekiel. Of the later prophets, Isaiah was the greatest, and so it would, I'm told by my Hebrew Bible scholars that it was not uncommon to simply refer to the later prophets by referring to Isaiah, okay? So it was written in the prophet Isaiah. It was just a way of saying it was written in the later prophets, right? But would everybody have known that? These Gospels are being written, as Mark's was, to include Gentile readers. They're going to get copied and passed along over the centuries. So here's what seems to have happened. As this text got copied, someone later realized, wait a minute, this says, as it was written in the prophet Isaiah, but this first half wasn't written in Isaiah. It was written in Malachi. So what did that scribe do? Took Isaiah off, as it was written in the prophets. Now, every copy that gets made off of that scribe's copy, every manuscript, is just going to have, as it was written in the prophets, you see? So here we are in the 21st century, and we're finding, we're receiving manuscripts. These are coming out of, where these come from? Well, monasteries over the centuries housed them. Some were found from the Old Testament. You're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those were found in the 1940s in a cave around the Dead Sea. So we're getting copies and copies and copies of these books, and scholars are having to figure out, how did this happen where you have a variant reading here? You have some manuscripts that say a prophet Isaiah and some that say just in the prophets. So then they have to determine which one, back to John's question, which one was probably there when Mark wrote? And what they do is they ask themselves, well, what would most likely describe what a scribe would have done over the centuries? Would a scribe have added Isaiah in there or taken Isaiah out? Well, to add Isaiah in would be to add a mistake, right? In the scribe's thinking. So they think, well, that's probably not what happened. They probably wanted to smooth over what they saw as a mistake in the original composition. And so they took Isaiah out. You tracking with me here? All right, so when I say, to answer your question finally, John, I'm sorry for such a long-winded explanation. We can see very clearly that some editorial work like this kind of thing was done over the years on the Gospels and on all the biblical books, incidentally, that we have for as we compare manuscripts. But it's very slight. It's this kind of thing. So you're asking about the 8-chapter structure. Again, chapters weren't part of the original division. But in terms of the big picture structure of Mark, we can be very confident that what we have overwhelmingly, if I had to put a percentage, 90-some% is exactly what the early church had. We're reading the same gospel. Now, we're going to get to an even bigger one. If you want to flip, if you really want, I'm just going to leave you with this because we don't have time today, but we are going to talk about this. So stay tuned. You're really going to want to get to Mark 16 when we get to this last chapter. I'll have someone, so flip to Mark 16. And anyone can do this on any Bible. It's all going to be a little different depending on the version that you have, whether you have an NIV or an NRSV or whatever. But let's just survey what we have. Look at your Bibles and look at Mark 16, chapter 8. Mark chapter 16, verse 8. Verse 8. Okay. Now I'll read it for us. Okay. So they went out. This is referring to the women who are at the tomb. They went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Okay. Now tell me what comes next in your Bibles.
Longer reading.
Okay.
Longer.
So
Longer ending.
the longer ending. So someone has the longer ending. Is that what some of you say?
Yeah.
I have the shorter ending.
Okay. And some have. Very good. Some, like Alden's Bible, the NRSV is going to include a shorter ending. And then Alden, what does your Bible say after the shorter ending? So maybe
The longer ending.
there you go.
Oh, my shorter ending comes after that.
Okay, very good, Jan. All right. I'm just going to leave it with you for now. What do you think is happening here? Basically, the version I'll leave you with here, not the shorter ending of Mark, but the short version of my description, just so you're not totally left in the dark, is that, again, we have some manuscript variety.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not clear whether Mark ends at verse 8, includes just another couple small verses, or actually includes a much longer ending, several more verses. When I say it's not clear, there is a consensus, once again, among modern Bible scholars, that Mark actually ends at verse 8. But a lot of the church, John, to your question, through the medieval period, would have read the longer ending. And so this would be the only kind of really substantive or lengthy thing that we might say in the Gospel of Mark, that the Bible that we have versus maybe the early church, or the early church's Bible versus the medieval church's Bible, there might be a slight difference. Again, in terms of theology, there is some substance in this that we'll get to when we get to 16, but overwhelmingly, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as Mark starts verse 1, from AD 65 when it was written to AD 2021 as it was written, is overwhelmingly the same. It's the same. And even the stuff from the longer ending here probably reflects later readers knowing other gospel accounts, putting something back into Mark that they see is missing, they think is missing. And we'll talk about that. So in other words, in terms of the full gospel picture, if we include all of the writers, Matthew, Luke, John, nothing in chapter 16 is out of step with what's in there in the New Testament. It's just, did Mark actually in an AD 65 include an ending that stopped at what is now verse 8, or was it a little longer, or was it much longer? Well, that's where we get into these decisions that have to be made by readers of the Bible today as we're inheriting these manuscripts. So does that answer your question? Overwhelmingly, it's all the same, but there are some interesting variations. One of the most famous ones is actually in the Gospel of John. We're talking most about the Synoptics, but in John, there is the famous story where Jesus, where a woman is about to be stoned, and Jesus, this is John 8, and Jesus basically says, he writes something in the sand and then says, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. Are you familiar with that account in John's Gospel? Mm-hmm. That account, many think, probably was not original to John's Gospel. But that's the Gospel of John. We can do that study another time. The very same mechanism for making these determinations that would be done in that case is what we're going to encounter a little bit more of here as we go through the Gospel of Mark together. So hopefully as we do this, we'll all be better informed Bible readers, I suppose. And when we encounter footnotes in our Bibles, like the one that Alden read, we'll have maybe a better sense for why that footnote is there. But whenever you see a footnote about that, it's just one thing to mention. Whenever you see a footnote that says other authorities say, other ancient authorities say, or other manuscripts say, what's happening is that you have translators of an English Bible. And in the modern world, this is always done by committee, if you're wondering. When I was at seminary, one of the lead translators of the NIV, his name is Ron Youngblood. He's the one who taught me Old Testament, actually, and he taught me Hebrew. Ron was an early Western scholar in the caves in Qumran, not long after the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So he's a very recognized figure in Hebrew Bible studies. Ron would bring translation committees to the seminary, and they would meet in our library's upper room, and translate sections of the Bible together. And whenever I found out they were doing it, that upper room had like a 3/4 wall on one side. So I would fake like I was going up to read, but really what I would do is I would just sit on it at a table on the other side of that wall to listen to the committees as they were making their decisions about translation. And they would be these kind of discussions. They'd say, okay, well, you know, this manuscript history says this manuscript, and then they would argue with each other about which one they should put in the main body of the text and which version they might put in a footnote, like we just read, other authorities say, blah, 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 and which they should just say, well, this doesn't have enough credence, we'll leave it aside entirely. It's not important enough for our English readers to know about. I always loved that. I remember, I'll never forget, they were doing some work on Exodus, and I really enjoyed listening to because they're always updating the NIV, the NRSV, they're always updating these translations. And so you'd get a sense for what the next update was going to have. And it was always just slight wording, like I've been saying, but it was, to me, it was always fascinating. But that's how this work goes. So, all right, you've just learned far more probably than you wanted to, and I hope I haven't bored you completely. But this is what the work of modern Bible scholarship entails. Let me go back then to our presentation, and we will continue on. Oh, hang on, I got the wrong. Sorry, I got the wrong slide. There we go. We'll do this. All right. As I said, beginning in the 19th century, Bible scholars argued that the traditional claim since Augustine that Matthew wrote first did not fit the arrangement of the material in the Gospels. So I'll try to explain a little bit about what that means. Instead, it seemed that Mark must have written first, followed by Matthew and Luke, who relied on Mark and a second source. And that second source, you might have heard of Q. Q's been it's been in the media for a few decades. And Q is actually, most think that it was, where did this Q designation originate? And last I heard, it's eluded consensus, but probably is short for the German word Quelle, which means source. Most now will concur that Mark writing first, followed by Matthew and Luke, best explains the fact that here's the key idea. All right, so again, we're not gonna be able to take much time, but I'll invite you to do this on your own later if you'd like. You can write these references down, because in the interest of time, I don't think we'll read them together today. But here's the key idea. There are significant portions of the gospel where Matthew and Mark agree in order and wording. Then there are others where Luke and Mark agree in order and wording. And other portions where only Matthew and Luke agree, but not with Mark. And then, of course, there are still others where Matthew and Luke seem to kind of progress on their own, where they don't agree with Mark or with each other. Now, when I say agree, I don't mean, I want to clarify, that doesn't mean that they contradict. That's not it. Agree means simply that they're, well, let's look at one of these anyway. All right, so if you flip to Matthew 14, and I'll just put your finger at Matthew 14, okay? And at the same time, flip to Mark 6. Okay. All right. Now, if you do this, and we'll just look at just cursory look here in Mark 6, we have Jesus. We're going to start here at Mark 6:14. So this is the death of John the Baptist. From the death of John the Baptist, we move to the feeding of the 5,000. From the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walks on water. Then Jesus heals the sick in Gennesaret. Then Jesus has this conflict with the religious authorities about washing cups and hands and stuff when we eat. Then goes to heals the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, then heals a deaf man, excuse me. And then we have the feeding of the 4,000. Okay, as I said, there are a couple of feedings in Mark. All right. And then there's some more after that. All right. But that you get the same idea. Now flip back to Matthew 14. And look what we've got. The death of John the Baptist, followed by the feeding of the 5,000. Then Jesus walks on water. Then Jesus heals the sick in Gennesaret. Then the tradition of the other, and then the conflict of religious leaders about the things that defile. Then Jesus healing in Tyre and Sidon. Then the feeding of the 4,000. So in other words, what we've got is Matthew and Mark closely agreeing with each other on order of events, right? Does everybody see that? Does that make sense? Okay. But here's the thing. If you look at the corresponding accounts in Luke, the order is not the same. Okay. Now you can do this on your own later. You can go to Luke 9 and Mark 6 again, and you'll Mark 6 and then skip to 8:27 to 9:41. You're going to have to do that in Mark to kind of put things together from Luke's order with Mark's order of events and what's happening in Mark and Luke. So what we've got, in other words, is we have a section of Mark that agrees with Matthew. We have another section of Mark that agrees with Luke, right? Okay. But then if you look to the other side of my screen here, you'll see there are places where only Matthew and Luke agree. So in other words, Mark is out of the picture. Matthew and Luke are recording things that, for instance, Mark doesn't talk about at all. So in Matthew and Luke 4, there's the temptation of Jesus. Mark mentions it, but gives none of the detail that we see in Matthew and Luke. But Matthew and Luke's detail is very, very much the same. There's one slight change of order in there, but basically the same. Same thing with Matthew and Luke in chapter 10 of Matthew and, Luke 10 and Matthew 9:35 to 10. I apologize for this reference here. That should be Luke 10, I believe, 2 to 11 and Matthew 9. So you can write these references down and look at them on your own, but let's just back up and try to get big picture again. So here's what we've got. We've got sections of Mark that agree with Matthew and sections that agree with Luke. We've got sections of Matthew and Luke that agree together, but not with Mark. Mark's not recording any of this material. Okay? All right. What's happening there, do you think? Well, modern Bible scholarship, again, has concluded probably the best explanation is that Matthew and Luke are writing after Mark, and each one is looking at Mark, right? As Matthew composes Matthew's gospel and as Luke is composing Luke's gospel, they're both looking at Mark. And for whole sections, they're actually following Mark really closely. But there are other sections where they might be looking at something else. Why? Well, because they're writing independently. Matthew and Luke are probably, I'll come back to that, probably writing independently. And yet they agree so closely, like in this temptation account of Jesus. Well, why would they agree so closely? Well, probably because they're drawing off of a common second source. They're drawing off of Mark, and then they're drawing off of another source that would make them agree with each other when Mark is silent. When Mark's not talking about the temptation, another source is, and it's giving them all this detail in this particular order. And then thirdly, they're doing their own work. Matthew has his own agenda, Luke has his own agenda, and that's how their gospels come together. They're working off of Mark, they're working off of Q, and then in addition, they're kind of doing their own editorial work. So that's what we call the two-source hypothesis. In other words, that Mark and another source are the main sources for Matthew and Luke, rather than this idea that Matthew wrote first, and then Mark, and then Luke, and maybe that they're all just getting a common source of information or something like that. All right, so that's probably more than you wanted to know, but I share that only because if this is correct, and it's pretty compelling, I think. If it's correct, then the idea that Mark drew off of some source material besides Peter, that's the point. We have a pretty firm tradition that Mark is learning from Peter. But Mark might also be, Mark is a human being hearing from others as well, and Mark might be encountering at least some other oral source tradition. That's not actually out of the realm of possibility, because that's how these documents seem to have been put together. And oh, by the way, if we look at Old Testament books, they also exhibit this kind of editorial construction. Here's the key idea then. All right, so like I said, I don't want to just talk about this for the sake of sort of arcane biblical scholarship. Noting that Mark drew upon oral or maybe even written fragments of tradition can help us to appreciate Mark's intentions in the gospel as a whole and in individual sections. Here's the idea. Knowing that the evangelist functions as much as an editor as a composer, so in other words, not just writing things down, but drawing off of things that were already either written down or spoken and including them, so editing things together, helps us to identify and appreciate major themes. As we read, we should always be asking ourselves this question: why is this material here in this order? Okay, this is the yield of all this sort of maybe sort of boring modern Bible scholarship. It shows us that when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and so on, it helps us if we step back and say, okay, this was put here for a reason. There is a deliberate effort being made by an author / editor to put material together in a way to tell a particular kind of story, to advance particular themes. So I can't just look at this like it just sort of fell out of the sky onto my desk. I should be looking at this, thinking, always asking, why is it going like this? What point is made by this sequence of material going in this sequence versus another one? So if we go back to the geography issue, like I said, for those who are in our church services or have watched them, a few weeks ago, we preached on Mark 7, where Jesus is said to go to the region of the Decapolis. I'm going to put a map up in a little bit. I think we'll be able still to get to it today, where it'll show the Decapolis. He goes to the region of the Decapolis from Tyre by way of Sidon. And I shared in that sermon that's kind of nonsensical geography, because Sidon is not on the way to the Decapolis from Tyre. From Tyre, you got to go out of your way to get to Sidon to get to the Decapolis. But here's the thing. If we realize, okay, hang on, we've got an editor who is including geographic references like this, probably for a reason, to make a broader thematic point. Now we can read this going, okay, and I kind of try to make sense of this map, this cartography that makes no sense. Now we're realizing, oh, wait. What Mark is trying to say is that Jesus is extending the mission of God to the Gentiles, because that's what Tyre and Sidon represent. That's even what the Decapolis represents geographically here in the northern part and northeastern part of Israel. Okay. All right. So let me pause with that, and then I'll just make some summary observations. Does that make sense? I've covered a wide bit of material, but I'm trying to encourage us in the way we read the Bible. Does that make sense to just pause and say, actually, someone put this together like this for a reason. What's the reason? And if we're coming to the text always asking that question, maybe things will pop up out of the text that we didn't see before. There you go. Now I've played my hand. That's why I wanted to go through all that. Does that make sense? Anyway, at least theoretically, if we look at the Bible this way, can you see like, oh yeah, I could see.
Makes sense.
Why seeing, okay, Mark as an editor makes some sense. Okay. All right, well, let's look at some of this editorial work and try to figure out, well, what's going on here in Mark then for us, shall we? I'll share again and we'll press on. Taking a little longer today than I planned to, but that's all right. I apologize, I'm moving kind of slowly. Let's see, no, I want this share. I don't know why does it keep going to this slide. We're here. Okay. So summary base. So this is summarizing everything we've talked about so far. So Mark was written in the middle of the first century and reflects the teaching of the apostles, including Paul. So we mentioned that if Mark is in fact the John Mark of Acts, then he would have traveled with Paul and Barnabas on their missionary journeys. Mark may have also followed Peter, and again, as I said, if he's the John Mark of Acts, traveled with Paul. So so where's Mark's account coming from? Well, from what he's learned from them, that's where it's coming from. Mark wrote, as we said, last week, in order to encourage a suffering church. We remember last week that the historical context here may well have been the persecution, the first sort of formal persecution of the church under Nero in around AD 65. So, and we should keep that in mind as we're thinking, why is Mark writing the way Mark writes? Well, he's probably got a persecuted church in mind that he's writing to first and foremost. That gets us to the nature of a gospel. It's not just a straightforward record of history. It contains historical details, but it's presenting them in a way that intends to communicate grander truth. And so we shouldn't get too upset when a detail is missing. We talked last time about the fact that Mark's gospel starts when Jesus' ministry starts at maybe age 30. Matthew and Luke start with birth narratives. So is Mark's gospel deficient? Is it a bad history because it skips 30 years of Jesus' life? Well, no, that's not what a gospel is. A gospel is recording historical details, but in a way to make a point about them, not to give us a detailed biography. Because Mark is acting as much as an editor as a composer, we should try to be sensitive to the rationale behind the selections that he made. That's the surest way to begin to understand the gospel. It's trying to always ask, why did this material get included? And why is it put here? Versus another way it might have been put together. So when studying Mark, and I want to really stress this point, in any gospel, and when I stress studying, I'm not saying necessarily reading devotionally. There's great value in reading any of the Bible, just one verse at a time, a couple verses at a time, sort of meditatively thinking about what's presented. But if we really want to study and understand a book of the Bible, we should read it in larger chunks, a chapter or two at a time, maybe not just a verse, but a chapter, 2, 3, 4, and we should look for major themes. Because when these gospels are getting, or these books are getting put together, that's kind of the level that the editors are going to be working primarily on. It's putting a theme together in the way that the material is structured. Okay. All right. So this was our homework for this week. Let's read chapters 1 through 4. And these were the themes that we were going to look for. And then I'm going to pause and I want to ask you some questions. So the themes we were going to look for is the ways that Jesus demonstrates divine power. That was one. We're also going to look for the theme of conflict with Israel's religious leadership. And we're going to ask why? Why is Jesus in conflict with Israel's religious leaders? And then we're going to look for the theme of faith versus fear. So these were the three themes that we talked about looking for this week. So before I advance the slide here, again, let me get out of the screen share here and say, so for those who read Mark 1 through 4, I just want to hear your thoughts. What observations did you make? What questions did you have from the text? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, Jesus performed miracle after miracle after miracle in the first 4 chapters.
Indeed. Yeah, excellent, Ellen. That's very, very important. It's just like this onslaught of miracles, isn't it? Early on there.
Yep.
Yeah. So go ahead. Alden, were you going to say something?
Yeah, he seemed to do a lot of miracles, and then he said a lot in parables following the, to me, it was kind of like 2 divisions, miracles and then parables.
Outstanding. You'll be interested to know, Alden, if you haven't already, maybe this is why you're saying it, that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this modern scholarship I'm talking about really seized on that observation you made, even to the point where it suggested that some of the source material that Mark might have been drawing off of fell into 2 camps. So there were kind of sayings, sources, parables, and there were kind of miracle sources. And that's highly debated, whether that would be true or not, but it's an excellent point that you're making. We do see that. And I think we, from Mark's broader presentation, the two fit together quite nicely. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But great. Any other observations? These are terrific. I want to get back to Ellen's in just a sec, but anyone else have anything to add? Pat, you're muted. If you want to unmute yourself.
I said,
Let's
pardon
see.
me, I think. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself, Pat.
So
Up in
at the
right-hand corner.
yeah, at the bottom
I-
left, there you go.
There you go.
Okay, yeah. The thing that I have studied this book before. And the one thing that it was brought out was that the evil spirits and the demons that are always around Jesus and that he has to deal with.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a striking feature early on here, right away in Mark.
Yeah.
He's confronting. In fact, one of the most interesting things here, if you look at chapter 1, verse 24, he's confronting an evil spirit. Now, this is a man.
Mhm.
What's interesting is the verb. I'm sorry, not the verb. The number. So there's a singular reference here. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with unclean spirit. So that's right. In the Greek, it's a singular. But look what it says. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" Right? So to Pat's point, many have observed that what we have here is almost like a representative of the demonic, recognizing that in Jesus, something significant has come for the entire demonic, if you will. What do you want with us? What do you want with our class of existence, if you like? Not just what do you want with me? I'm tormenting this guy, let me keep it up. But no. There's something far grander here. And so there's a reason that shows up right away at the beginning of Mark. If we go back to our, why is this here? Why is this in this order? Well, Mark right off the bat is showing us there's this encounter with the demonic that is immediately recognized to be bigger than casting out a single demon. These are great observations. Any addition, anything else? Let's circle back to Ellen's point. She's absolutely right. We start off with the barrage of miracles here. Now, based on what we were just talking about, recognizing that Mark is as much an editor as a composer, recognizing that Matthew and Luke include similar stories, but not exactly like this, in precisely this order. Okay, so again, that's the point. So looking at Mark as putting these stories together in a way. Why does Mark start with this presentation of Jesus as boom, 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 miracle? There's a word in here that gets used repeatedly. You might have noticed it's immediately is usually how it's translated in English. Immediately Jesus does this. Immediately Jesus goes there. Immediately this happens. In Euthus in the Greek, it's boom, boom, boom. Jesus is moving from one place to the next, and he's curing, he's healing, he's casting out demons, he's confronting powers of darkness. So what picture do you get of Jesus by that kind of a presentation? Again, Matthew and Luke are starting with Jesus' birth narrative. Mark is starting with Jesus just pounding away on the forces of darkness. So how's that? Why might Mark be doing that, do you think? And what kind of picture of Jesus emerges?
Why do I think? Because I think it's trying to show overpowering proof that he's God, that he's the Son of God.
Great.
Mhm.
And you say
Great.
he's writing to the church that's being in Rome that's being persecuted. What better way for people who are believing but are being persecuted to know that this is the Son of God? There's a reason to keep believing. It's almost goosebumpy.
It is. Bingo, Ellen. Well, if I'm out of commission next week, Ellen, you take the class, okay? Because you've got it. I mean, you have just nailed it. There it is. There it is. Remember who Mark's writing to? Probably a persecuted church. And he's trying to reassure this church. And how does he reassure this church? By his strong presentation that Jesus, you've heard about this Jesus. You've heard about this Jesus maybe from the apostles Peter and Paul. Now, let me give you an account of who this Jesus was and what this Jesus did. And it just starts off like right between the eyes, power over everything, right? And if you're a persecuted church, there's this immediate presentation that the object of your faith is worthy of your devotion. Even though you may not feel that right now, even though right now you might feel that maybe not, maybe this Jesus didn't accomplish everything that I've been hoping and praying for in God's salvation. Mark is coming strong saying, oh yes, he did. Oh yes, he did. Let me make that clear. Now, as the gospel is going to progress, Mark's going to address then this fact that, well, then if Jesus did all this, then why are we still suffering? And if, again, we've been part of our worship services lately, you'll see that great transition's coming when we get to chapter 8, where we're going to shift from this powerful presentation of Jesus to the suffering servant presentation of Jesus. And so Mark is really going to hit both themes. But there you go. Excellent, Ellen. That's exactly right. So there's more to it that maybe we can unpack a little bit here in the time we still got together. But any other observations generally from your own reading before we dive in a little more deeper? And we'll try to, if you give me just maybe 10 more minutes, I know we've only got maybe 5 left on our time, but if you don't mind going 10, I appreciate it. And then we can, because I took a little longer than I should have. I apologize. That modern Bible scholarship always sucks me in. All right, let me share the screen again here, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we've just been discussing here. Okay, so, oops, sorry. Here we go. So here's where we left off. All right, so chapters 1 through 4, a few things. One of the things that right off the bat from chapter 1 we start to see clearly is this idea in Mark that in the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, the promised end has come. So in the first century world, there is clearly, we can see leading up to it in the first and second centuries before Christ, this flourishing of what we call apocalyptic literature. It's a lot of books like the book of John, book of Revelation. Pardon me, can't speak here. We're probably all familiar with the book of Revelation, the last book in our biblical canon. But there are other books like that were written. We call them apocalypses. They're written in a way to suggest that there is this cataclysmic coming of God into the world. And it's going to be the day of the Lord will be a day of the revelation of God to everybody. And so these books use some striking language to describe how this is all going to come about, as we know if you've read the book of Revelation. And I'd be happy to do a class on Revelation at some point if you like as well. I've taught one before, and it's always a really, I think, informative study. But in any event, so there's this strong expectation there, and what Mark is clearly doing is saying that absolutely the end has come. It's come in Jesus of Nazareth. So how do we get that view from Mark? Well, one of the ways within the Jewish tradition, within the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, that we have this expectation develop, or let me rephrase that. I didn't phrase that very well. A significant part of this expectation is the idea that God will send a messenger or maybe a couple of messengers back to prepare the hearts of the people for God's coming. And so Moses, but more specifically Elijah, is explicitly mentioned in Malachi 3 and 4 to be the agent that God will send back prior to the coming, to God's own coming at this great end of all things, okay? So we have that expectation that Elijah's coming. And so Mark starts off with this idea that the good news of God, the first line of the gospel, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and then what does Mark immediately do? Goes into a prophecy about the coming of someone who's going to prepare the way for God, and then goes immediately into who? John the Baptist. And John is presented in a way that associates him with Elijah. How so? Well, how's John described? Well, where Where is John ministering? Where does John appear?
The river.
Yeah, he's at the river, and a little more broadly, verse 4, appeared in the
Wilderness.
wilderness. Exactly. Well, that's why if you read, go back and read, in First Kings there, where's Elijah? He's often in the wilderness. What is the mantle of the prophet? Zechariah 13:4, in the interest of time, I won't have us flip back there, but Zechariah 13:4 describes the mantle, the garb of the prophet is this kind of hairy garb. Actually, Zechariah 13:4 is an interesting, Zechariah 13 is interesting because it's talking about the idea that when God is revealed, the prophets are going to kind of be shut up because there are all these false prophets. And what Zechariah 13:4 says is the garb of the prophet is one way that a false prophet sort of passes their existence off on the unsuspecting people. They wear this hairy garment, like camel's hair, and they take on this sort of wilderness look. And so that's what people think, oh, that's a prophet. Look, there's sort of the image. I don't know, we all have an image of a Hollywood actor, right? If I say I'm a Hollywood actor, everybody says, no, you're not. I can look at you and see that you're clearly not a Hollywood actor. Or even better, like happened in confirmation class, we did an icebreaker, two truths and a lie. And for one of the things, it's where you tell 3 things about yourself, 2 of them are true and 1 is not. And one of the things I said is that between Don and me, we have 20 million TikTok views. And if you know anything about TikTok, it's a social media platform for younger people. Well, any of us could be on it too, but especially younger people. And immediately, that's all it took. The confirmation class said, "Oh, that's a lie." And it wasn't that there were 20 million. They just immediately said, "There's no way you're on TikTok. That's ridiculous." I said, "What do you mean? How can you just?" And they're like, "Well, they basically said, well, look at you." And I said, "Well, gosh." So we make these associations, and that's the kind of thing you see in Zechariah 13. There's the association of a prophet, and it's what Elijah looked like. It's this wilderness, kind of almost wild man with wild clothing and wild hair or whatever. And so that's that's how John is described. He's eating locusts. He's out in the wilderness. He's wearing the prophet's garb, right? But bigger than that, even there are a couple of other things here in Mark 1. Jesus, the association of good news. So why doesn't, if someone would read, this is such an important passage, maybe, and we'll start to wrap up here with this and then these final 2 points. So Isaiah 52, if someone would flip to Isaiah 52 and read Isaiah 52, 7 to 10. Anyone who has it, go for it.
52 what?
Verses 7 to 10.
I got it.
Thanks, John.
How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, you sentinels, lift up their voices. Together they sing for joy. For in plain sight they see the return of the Lord of Zion. Break forth together in singing, your ruins of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see salvation of our God.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. So how beautiful are the feet of the person who declares, well, the day of the Lord, the day of God's salvation. That's described again as good news, right? And as I said last time, how's that characterized? The return of the king to the king's people. So who's Israel's ultimate king? God. And so what do we have? God returning to Zion. And so how beautiful is the messenger, that's the point, the feet of the messenger who comes running ahead of the king, running ahead of the king's army, returning home, and says, our God reigns, our king is victorious. So we're not going to be exiled, we're not going to be slaughtered. we're going to be vindicated. We're going to be raised up. We're going to be exalted. We're going to enjoy the spoils of our king's victory. And that image of the ancient Near Eastern king and the good news of that king's return in Israel, that is applied, of course, to God and God's salvation. God's salvation is construed in those terms. But now it's associated with Jesus. That's the point. What Mark is doing for you persecuted Roman Christians, the messenger has come. Elijah has returned in the form of John the Baptist. And how beautiful is the message that he brings. Salvation has come. God's victory over all the forces of darkness that we're subjected to has happened in Jesus. So be encouraged. From one last component to this, from again, the context of Jewish theology and the Hebrew Bible, in Exodus 23, the messenger of the Lord is actually an angel. And the language is almost identical. The messenger who will go before me, who will go before you to prepare the way. So the idea is that the angel of the Lord goes before Israel on the way to the promised land. So on the way into, remember in Exodus, what's happened is that Israel's been delivered from slavery out of Egypt, and they're making their way through the wilderness to the promised land. And the promise is that a messenger of God will go before you to help bring you to the promised land. And so that's the imagery that Mark is drawing off of here in talking about John as fulfilling Old Testament expectations for God's messenger coming to prepare the way. It's happened here, he's saying, in essence, you see? And it's glorious because that means that with John coming and Jesus following, we have the end begun. The end has started, the end time expectation of God's return. And it'll take the form, everything that was so grand about Israel's own exodus is going to happen again now, but on a worldwide, if you like, scale, or at least Mark is going to unfold this in a way that we'll see that it's on a worldwide scale. Initially, the expectation is that salvation is for Israel, but as the gospel continues, we're going to see that actually the salvation that God brings is for everybody. And so that's what's starting to happen here. We've got this imagery from the Old Testament, from Exodus, from Isaiah. It's being applied to John. And then Jesus, of course, takes it up on his own lips in 1:15. The time is fulfilled. There you go. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. And I wish we had another hour because that's probably how much we need to get through the rest of 1 through 4. And so I apologize that we're already so far behind. But thank you for bearing with me and giving me some extra time today. I do want to respect your time. So I'll pause with this. We'll stop right here, actually, take any final comments, questions, observations, and then we'll wrap it up. We'll pick it up here next time. For next time, I encourage you to read ahead. I was going to have you read 5 through 8, and if you're able to read 5 through 8, please do so. We'll try to move a little more quickly next time. I don't know that we'll get all the way through chapter 8 next time, because we're going to have to, it would be just as good for next time if you don't mind reviewing a bit of what you read in 1 through 4, and then maybe read a little 5 and 6, and that's probably as far as we'll get. But don't worry, I've built in a little time at the end where we can catch up, I hope. I learned to do that over the years. It's, I apologize. But any thoughts, observations, questions? Great job so far, really, truly. This is
Thank you.
stuff. Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm up for Revelations when you want to
Okay.
go study.
Yeah.
It's
All right,
the
Ellen, you
New
bet. We can.
Testament. It's the only book that I just can't get through.
I understand. There is so much imagery and symbolism in that book that it's very difficult. And honestly, some of it, we're still not entirely sure what it's referring to. But there is a lot that we can fairly well make out. And if you can make out the broad contours, I think Revelation sort of comes alive. So we'll try to do that. Absolutely. You bet.
Thank you,
Well,
Pastor.
Thank you,
Thank
darling.
you.
Thank you very much.
I love your enthusiasm.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, I appreciate you saying that. Well, thank you all for bearing with me. Yeah, we'll move ahead. And as you revisit maybe a little of chapters 1 through 4 and look ahead at 5 and 6, think about, again, keep asking these questions that, Ellen, excellent job. Think about why is this here? We didn't get yet. We'll talk next time about the conflict of the religious leaders. So maybe be asking yourself, especially as you look again at chapter 2, I call that the conflict chapter because it's just one right after the other. And think about what's being presented there. What's the broader theme that Mark is trying to help us see? Because that'll keep going as we get into 5, 6, 7, and 8. Be a big theme. So look at that and look at faith versus fear, as I said, and we'll pick it up here next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.